Welcome to Conversations with Tom Shorkey. Conversations explores the past, the present, and the future of the communities in which we live through the eyes of interesting individuals. Now let's join our host, Tom Shorkey.
Welcome to Conversations. I'm your host for today's program, Tom Shorkey. With me today, we have a guest who has either lived or worked in every community from Croswell, Lexington, Fort Gratiot, Port Huron, Marysville, St. Clair, Marine City. So if you don't recognize this face or name, I think you haven't had the Times Herald open in the last 15 or 20 years. It is my pleasure today to welcome as our guest the Superintendent of the St. Clair County RESA, Kevin Miller. Kevin?
Tom, it's good to be here.
Glad to have you.
That's quite the introduction, by the way. I appreciate that. What you're really saying is I get around.
Well, or you can't keep a job. I'm not sure which.
Right.
No, we try to do our show on people who have an impact in some way or another with the Blue Water area, and I think you're the epitome of somebody who's got the Blue Water area well covered. But Kevin, we'll get into RESA eventually. We'll get into your present job eventually. For our listeners at home, they often maybe recognize a name or a face or put you with one of your previous jobs, either in East China or Cross-Lex or at RESA. But they don't know much about how the whole thing started. Now, there is a story about a family from Battle Creek that took a summer vacation to Niagara Falls, and on their way back, they ended up living in Port Huron. Tell our listeners what that was all about.
Yeah, it's a great story. I love to tell it because it really is the reason I'm here today. I mean, life is a series of things that happen that create the next opportunity. I was 11. My sister was 8. We had traveled on a family vacation to Canada. Niagara Falls was our last stop. And my mom and dad were both born in Port Huron. So they were Port Huron born and raised. My dad had gone to Michigan State University, and out of Michigan State University got his first teaching job at Battle Creek Central High School. So that's where I was born. Lila Hospital in Battle Creek, and we lived in Lakeview section of Battle Creek. So we were on our way back from Niagara Falls. Literally vacation clothing. We stopped at both sets of grandparents for a day. And my dad's twin brother, Larry Miller, who was a longtime teacher at Port Huron Northern, said, "Jerry, there's a job in your certification area." My dad taught business, typing, shorthand, retailing, co-op, that type of thing. There's a job, and they haven't been able to fill it. This is now about 10 days before school is going to start in late August. My dad says, "Well, I've just got shorts and vacation clothing." He called the central office of Port Huron Schools, and they said, "We want you to come in." He said, "Listen, I literally don't even have a pair of jeans." They said, "It's okay, come on in." Hired him on the spot for the job. And my dad will tell the story that he went home and we were settled in Battle Creek. I mean, that had been their home for 13, 14 years. I was 11, so their children were both born and raised there. All their friends were there at that point. And my dad comes back and says to my mom, "Well, I accepted the job. We're moving to Port Huron." That wasn't a bad move because both my mom and dad were from there and both families were there. But literally, we went back to Battle Creek. My dad stayed behind to get the house ready for sale. And we moved into my grandparents' basement on my mom's side in Port Huron. The corner of 18th and Wall Street was where they lived. And thinking about where they looked at a few houses right away, and thinking of where they're going to make an offer, actually enrolled me at Garfield Elementary Middle. It was a K-8 building at the time, and I went to school a week later in Port Huron. Good thing is I had a cousin, Steve, my Uncle Larry's son, Steve, and Steve and I were more like brothers than cousins. Steve was in my grade level at Garfield, so I knew somebody, but otherwise, what a way to start in Port Huron. Well, that's how we ended up there.
Well, let me ask you this, and this is for our listeners in the Port Huron area. So Garfield, and some older folks do remember that when that was a K-8 building. Now, did your sister end up at Garfield also?
She did. So I was in.
So where did you proceed after Garfield?
So I was in 6th. She was in 3rd. I started 6th grade there. She was 3 years behind me in 3rd grade. She ended up going to Holland Woods because that was built and opened by the time she got to the middle school level. But I never attended Holland Woods. It opened the year after I went to Port Huron Northern. So I went to Garfield K-8 middle school in grades 6, 7, and 8, and then went to Port Huron Northern and graduated from Port Huron Northern in grades 9 through 12. I like to say that move that we mentioned kind of after your first question to Port Huron paved the way for me to get into my first love, which was radio.
Well, let's talk about that for a minute. You come to Port Huron, you're an 11-year-old kid, early 70s, and somewhere along the way, and this is for our listeners at home who have children or grandchildren that might be in high school now, and the big focus is, especially for juniors and seniors, where are you going to go to college? What are you going to major in? What are you going to do with the rest of your life? Now, we got a guy here who is the Chief Executive Education Officer in this county, and we're going to hear a story at home about some of the circuitous paths that people take to their landing base. So you're here. You're in Port Huron. You're going to Northern. You were a little baseball player and a couple other things along the way. What was your real love?
Yeah, so from the time I was 7 or 8, I knew I wanted to do sports broadcasting. And I was one of those kids with those electronic hockey games, you know, where you control the players, that I would be doing play-by-play with the players' names, you know, Montreal Canadiens versus the Detroit Red Wings in the hockey game, and I'd be doing play-by-play while we're playing. So early on, I knew that I wanted to be in radio and specifically in sports broadcasting. So moving to Port Huron, had no idea at the time that by the time I arrived at Port Huron Northern, they had a high school radio station. And you'll remember this name because his wife was an administrator in Port Huron, but Bob Trapp was my speech teacher in 9th grade at Port Huron Northern. And it was about halfway through the first semester of 9th grade speech. So we're talking about this time of the year, you know, the late fall, early winter. We've done a few speeches in front of the class, and Bob comes up to me and says, you know, he was a former radio guy that had got into education. Talk about a great role model, right, Tom? So Bob says, you need to be in my broadcast class. And I don't normally he doesn't generally even have sophomores in the class, let alone freshmen. But he said, I'd like you to consider doing a shift on the radio, and then next year as a sophomore, you know, get into my full-time broadcasting class. And I thought, what a perfect spot for me. You know, so I did a DJ slot on the radio, but I also ended up going to some sporting events, the sports that I didn't play. I was playing football, basketball, and baseball as a freshman, but then I kind of dropped off the grid of playing sports by the time I got my junior year, because I would actually go to the games with a tape recorder, do the play-by-play for a game, and then we play it later, you know, on the high school radio station, 91.9 WORW in Port Huron. Still exists today.
It sounds a lot. You know, many of our people at home listened to our interview about a year ago with Mike Emmerich. It was about a year ago this time. I think it was in November. And that was kind of how he got his start down in Indiana. Now, did you ever cross paths with Doc back at that time? Was he in Port Huron?
He was. He was a broadcaster for the Port Huron Flags. And I remember gave you a little pass there of when I was 15 as a freshman. So now fast forward a year later, and I'm looking not only to you know, working at the Port Huron Northern radio station as a volunteer, but maybe as a career opportunity in radio. Doc was in the booth. This was during a Port Huron Flags game. I had gotten a special pass to be able to be in the booth. And I had a tape recorder, and I was doing play-by-play. And I remember the game like it was against the Toledo Gold Diggers. It was a Port Huron Flags against Toledo Gold Diggers. And Doc came up to me during the period break, and they were in a booth just down from me, but they weren't enclosed booths. Yeah. So he could hear me, you know, kind of doing my own play-by-play. And he stopped by and said, you know, this was during the exhibition season, would you like to do a period with me? And pulled me into their booth, did a period with Doc, became a good friend of our family. And so I rekindled the relationship with him this summer at the retirement of one of our longtime friends, Bill Gilmer, from a local radio station. So Doc was certainly influential in me getting a start. He gave me some tips. I ended up working for the competitive radio station WPHM as a teenager, while Doc was working for WHLS, but we talked often, and certainly an influence on my career.
Well, now you're in high school and you're at Northern, and you've got this taste of broadcasting now. Your classmates are looking, well, we're going to go to U of M and be lawyers or doctors, or we're going to, a lot of people in Port Huron, in the Blue Water area, went to community college first. As you approached the end of your high school, what was your thinking regarding a profession or education?
So I looked at it a number of ways, and it's interesting. In your open, you've talked about, the preparation for college or the preparation for the future. So I tried to cover all of my bases. So as I'm approaching my senior year, I applied at Western Michigan University, and I actually was going to get a dual major there. I was going to work in education, but also get a minor in communications as well, so that if I wanted to pursue radio as a full-time career, and if that didn't go well, I would do a fallback to a job in education as well. Well, not really a fallback, I shouldn't call it that. I mean, a second opportunity, if you will. So I'm graduated from high school. I've already got 2 years experience at WPHM, going from working 15 or 20 hours a week to working full-time by the time I'm in my senior year. So now I go, okay, do I really want to go away, leave this job at WPHM, which I'm flourishing in the role? So I decided to stay and go to SC4, put off my 4-year degree until 2 years later, and continue my job at WPHM. So I'd work my college hours around my radio station schedule, and by then I was sports director at WPHM. So 2 years later, then at 20, I've already been accepted at Western Michigan. And I graduate from SC4, and I said, I'd always wanted to live in Florida. Grandparents had a trailer there, had journeyed there many times. So I took a handful of tapes and resumes and 4 years experience on my side as a 20-year-old. And I went to the 13th largest radio market in the country in Tampa, knocked on 2 doors. The first one, I didn't get to see anybody in management. The second one, though, comes down the stairs, takes me up into the newsroom, interviews me, listens to my tape, offers me a job on the spot. So here I'm a 20-year-old, and I'm like, oh, wow, I'm going to be working in Tampa. So I drove back home, packed my belongings up, and moved to Florida.
And that was for a job, you weren't going to go to school at that time.
Right.
You were going to see where this career would take you.
Absolutely, and it took me to a wonderful place. I like to say now that I'm maybe the only sitting superintendent in U.S. history that was also a broadcaster for the Tampa Bay Buccaneer Football Network in my background. I mean, so that's a weird track to take to become a school superintendent, but I'm a firm believer that every job that you have prepares you with different skill sets to be able to do the job that you're going to get later if you decide to change careers. So I worked down in Tampa for a number of years, found a wonderful young lady down there that I fell in love with. She was a senior. Kimberly was a senior at University of South Florida playing tennis, and we met literally 2 months before her graduation. I went out to watch a match. I could tell you who they played. They played Ohio State in that tennis match, and just to see how competitive she was. She was an athlete. We connected right away. I told my parents a month later this is the woman I was going to marry, and sure enough, less than a year later we were married. And it was about the time then that our first daughter was born, Christy, that we both sat down and I said, I don't know that our station in Tampa had been bought a number of times. It was almost like a sale of a commodity at that time. I worked for Taft Broadcasting, ABC Cap Cities, CBS, Sharing Plow. I mean, it was sold and sold and sold and sold, and each time new people would come in. And it was looking like that's not what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. It was a very unstable atmosphere at that time. So I began to look at other opportunities, and those opportunities were better fit in my former community of Port Huron, where I had all the contacts. Business owners would hire me. So I actually accepted a job at Lawrence Jewelers. Larry Schlager, Lawrence Schlager, owned the jewelry store. He hired me to be his bookkeeper in late 1986, and I was on the job less than a month, and John Hill, who had hired me as a 16-year-old at WPHM, came in to buy his wife Grace a necklace for Christmas. Kevin, you're back in town. Why don't you come and do the morning show with me at WPHM? I didn't work until 9 o'clock at the jewelry store, so I would go in from 6 to 8:30, work a couple hours at the radio station, rekindled the old relationship with John, And then a year later, John retired as program director, and I took the management seat that John had held. So here I am programming the station that I worked for as a teenager as a manager of the radio station.
That's quite a full circle story. So when did the light go on for you that said, this broadcasting's interesting and it's fun? Was your wife in teaching at that time?
No, she was teaching professionally at the Port Huron Tennis House, teaching tennis, and running a little daycare business out of our house, because we at that point then had 3 young children, 3 girls all under the age of 5. So she was doing dual role.
It's nice for our audience to know that Kevin's wife was the big influence, because all 3 girls at one time or another were the Blue Water Area Tennis Player of the Year, and I think one of them ended up Georgia Tech.
Yep. Christy was, all 3 played well. Christy was always ranked in the top 10 or 15 players nationally in her age group. So by the time she got to the end of her junior year, when the college recruiting season started, she was recruited just by about every university in the country. Very fortunate to be able to go wherever she wanted, basically, to play the game and to pursue her college education. So combination of a factor. First of all, she wanted to go south so she could play outdoors for the first time in her career. Because Port Huron, you play out indoors most of the year. So she drew a line south of the Mason-Dixon line and said, I want to go south of there. So she narrowed it down to Florida, Florida State, Clemson, Georgia, and Georgia Tech is where she narrowed it down to. And the coach and the atmosphere of Atlanta, and where the team was, and she knew she could step right in and make a major contribution. She ended up going to Georgia Tech and then playing #1 all 4 years and winning a national championship there. Really proud of what she accomplished in her career there.
So back to dear old Dad. When did the light go on for you that maybe something besides broadcasting would be your career?
So it was and I won't mention his name, there was a gentleman who worked for the other radio station in town that had been there for about 30 years. And near the end of his career, they changed formats, they changed owners, they let him go. So I'm looking at this as a 31-year-old program director and thinking, I don't own the station. I'm probably never going to own it. I'm not family. And so I really looked at it as I always thought about being in teaching. Let me go back and just chip away at my education degree. So I went back. I had actually finished my bachelor's at 27, knowing that I would need further schooling. So now I go into a master's program at Wayne State, and it allowed you to not only get your teaching certification along the way, but to chip away at your master's. All the classes were 500 level and above.
I remember that program.
So I'm chipping away at my master's, but also getting my teaching certificate. And in the fall then of 1992, I have my teaching degree and interviewed at both Port Huron and Marysville. Never got the offer from Port Huron because I accepted the job at Marysville first. They offered me the job first, and I went to Marysville Middle School as a teacher. But I had been, I was really a kind of a crazy man this way. I took 62 credit hours in a year and a half at Wayne State University while with a family full time, and I give my wife a lot of credit for really not having a husband for 18 months because it was either do that or chip away at this thing for 3 or 4 years. And be going to Wayne State 2 days a week. So I just went 4 days a week in the evenings and got it quickly and ended up with a great opportunity in Marysville Public Schools.
So you worked and you taught in Marysville for a while, and then you started eyeballing administration a little bit. What was your first administrative job?
So my job at Marysville in the middle school, Sandy Standella, you may remember that name. Sandy was the principal that hired me. And then immediately Sandy got a job as an administrator, upper level administrator, I think it was in the Royal Oak school system, but Sandy left us, and then John Cezanne was in a leadership role there, and then we actually hired a gentleman from Anchor Bay. Dave Randolph became our principal. But Dave saw where my strengths were when I got hired there, and so they created a journalism class that I was able to teach at the middle school, along with teaching world history and geography. Well, Tom Haddon, the principal at Marysville High School, called me about 4 years later and said, we built this learning center in the basement of Marysville High School. We've got an empty radio and television area there that we've never pursued. We want to pursue it now. You're the guy. Oh. Of course, my background was perfect. So now I get to teach my love. I mean, I'm in dream world, Tom. So it took me about 3 seconds to accept Tom's offer to go over to the high school. And so literally we built the station from scratch. The tech director and I ordered all the equipment, built the television studio first, and then built a radio studio the next year. And it was during that time I was only teaching 4 of the 5 periods. So I had an extra period that the district asked me then, because I was also heavy into technology. And I had pursued and gotten my technology ed specialist degree. So I was one of the early adopters of the internet, and really got heavy into teaching staff about this new thing called the internet and how to use it in education. So I would go around to staff meetings and actually do speaking to the staffs. And so that was my first foray into leading a staff meeting and seeing myself as more than just a teacher. So an opportunity came up at Marine City High School. I was fortunate enough to have folks that I'd gotten to know a little bit in East China, Rod Green, the superintendent, Keitha Knuth, the assistant superintendent, and Bob Rood, the principal at Marine City High. And the 3 of them, fortunately for me, gave me the opportunity at my first opportunity to lead as an assistant principal at Marine City High for a year, and then was given an opportunity to lead St. Clair Middle School as a principal the following year. So I left in 2003. In 2004, then I took the job at St. Clair, and I was there from 2004 to 2007 as principal.
And then a superintendent job opened up.
Yeah.
Croswell, Lexington. Did you think you had a shot, or?
This is where I really thank Rod Green. Rod and Keitha both had given me opportunities as a building administrator in East China that you don't often get. Rod saw that I had little different people skills, and this is a compliment to you. I think you and I are a lot alike in that we'd have no problem being in the public eye. We have no problem going in buildings and shaking hands and being visible. So Rod had seen that part of me, so he actually brought me into the bargaining team. So I had bargained. We went through interest-based bargaining training. Keith and I had spent a lot of time on HR. East China had done a buyout, so we hired 30-some people one year together. So I'd gotten really a lot of experience in the middle management, despite the fact that I was a principal. So Rod actually is the one that told me about the job at Croswell Lexington. He knew that I aspired for more at that point than just being a building principal. And Rod said, well, we need great superintendents in this state, and I think you'd be a good one. Chuck Smith has just told us at the St. Clair County meeting at RESA that he's going to be retiring next June, and they're going to start the process in February. And Bill Kimball, former Port Huron superintendent, was doing
all kinds of connectors
oh
here.
my gosh! So Bill knew my family. Bill was doing the search for the Michigan Leadership Institute for Croswell Lexington, and Bill. So I went through the application process. Bill called me and did a little background information on me. Now, I've only been a building administrator 4 years, but I'm 46. So I'm not a young, no, I was 45. I was not a young buck. So, and I had business experience on my side as well. So I think that was an advantage. But Bill then called Rod and said, tell me about Kevin. And Rod said, I think he's going to be a terrific superintendent. And Bill said, well, we're not sure we're going to interview him, because there's 4 superintendents that are also in the field and Rod said, oh no, Bill, Kevin's going to be one of your top 2 candidates, I will assure you. And Bill kind of laughed, and Rod said, I'm not joking.
Yeah.
So on that basis of Rod's comments, Bill threw me in the pool of 6 to be interviewed. And Bill told me this story after my first round interview. He called me that night and said, boy, you did a great job on the first round interview. I think it's your job to lose. Now, they really like you. They want to bring you back for a second round interview. And of course, the rest is history. Now I ended up doing the second round interview, of which really that was where I was allowed to thrive. You interview with all the bargaining groups. You meet the teachers. You meet the administrators after school. You have dinner with the board. Then you go do the second round interview, which is really community oriented. They're allowed to ask questions from the audience. And that's where my radio background came in really handy. I mean, if you've done a broadcast where there's 3 million people listening, standing in front of 100 is not going to make you real nervous.
Piece of cake.
No, I mean, so that's where those communication skills as a superintendent come in handy.
How long were you at Croswell?
7.5 years.
And that was, and by that time I may have been in Port Huron at the time. I'm not sure.
You were part of my time.
Yeah,
Yep.
but I was kind of watching things, and you really had a wonderful ride as superintendent up there. You got a lot of things were initiated, the satisfaction of the staff, the community. I mean, they kind of fell in love with Kevin Miller as a leader.
I like to say they adopted me. Yeah.
Was that when the middle college first came into play?
So one of the very first meetings, and Theo Kerhulis, who is an executive director in Port Huron Schools now, Theo can tell the story better than I do, but my very first meeting with Theo is in the summer of '07, after I started July 2nd of '07. This is a couple of weeks later, and Theo's on his summer break, but he comes up.
And he was the principal at the high school at that time.
Yep,
Okay.
principal of Croslex High School. So he comes up to meet with me, and we met in Theo's office at the high school, actually, because I always tried to meet on their turf, not on mine. If you come in my office, it seems like the superintendent's office. Let's meet in their office. So we meet in Theo's office, and that way he feels more comfortable. And Theo's a list maker. Theo has a list of things he wants to talk to me about in my first year as superintendent. One of those is, what are we going to do? Because they had one AP course at Croslex High School. This is a great small district who doesn't know how good it can be. That's my kind of analysis of Croslex at the time. So we talk about a number of things that we would like for the future of his high school and for the students of Croslex. And eventually, and it's one of my favorite stories to tell, on the corner of a scratched piece of paper, so it's kind of a circular corner, he rips it off, and he writes on there, global readiness. And then he puts the GL, the Global Readiness Network, the GRN, Global Readiness. So we want kids to be globally ready when they graduate from his high school. Well, when I left Croslex 7.5 years later, Theo had framed that little corner he had kept it all those years, and he put it in a frame and with a quote of mine, and I still have that in my office today. So if anybody that's watching ever visit my office, I'll show you Theo's little frame that he gave me with that, because that conversation drove everything we did from there on out in the school district. The next year, I'd done some research on early and middle colleges. We decided to add one. We're 40 miles.
In 30 seconds. Because if we get too much into the educational jargon, people go, well, what's he talking about? Tell the people in our listening audience in 30 seconds the concept of middle college.
So early middle colleges give the student an opportunity in their junior, senior, and a year after their senior year to get a college diploma while they're taking high school classes as well. I'd done research on this. I saw it. I called the El Paso superintendent, El Paso, Texas. All their high schools had these. It was very early on. There was only 3 in Michigan at the time. Went to visit the guru of middle colleges in Michigan, Cherry Wagenlander, over at Mott Community College and Mott ISD. And Theo and I immediately decided we needed this for Croslex High School. Only 11% of Sanilac County residents had a college degree at that point. That's our job to do something about that. And that wasn't acceptable to us. So the very next year, then, we started one in conjunction with Kevin Pollock, Dr. Kevin Pollock at SC4, who saw the vision behind that. And together we started that program. And then, of course, the Blue Water Middle College at RESA, Dan DeGrow called me the following year, and that was really our first contact as professionals together. I'd known Dan a long time, but Kevin, why did you start this? What was your thought process? Why did you do it the way you did it? And they ended up using our paradigm. I think they improved on it, actually. But then they did it at Blue Water Middle College, and several of the districts in St. Clair County now participate in that one as well.
So what happened? Everything was wonderful in Croslex, and you ended up at St. Clair County RESA.
Yeah.
We'll get to RESA in a minute. But how did that little transition happen?
It's another great story, Tom. So I'm coming out of the worst winter that I can ever remember. We had 17 snow days at Croslex. I'm not a big fan of winter anyway. I go through times in the wintertime where I have to sit in front of a white light because I can't stand the darkness. I think they call it seasonal affective disorder. So now fortunately as a superintendent, I could take a couple of vacation weeks and get out to Florida and get in the sunshine and get that out of my system. But we come through this period where I think for about 40 straight school days, I was up at 3:34 in the morning, making tough decisions, because even any wind that we had walls of snow on Babcock Road in Lexington that were 4 to 5 feet high. If you got a west wind, there'd be 2 feet of snow on that road the next morning with no snow, with no snowfall. Yeah. The whole winter was that way. So I'm exhausted by the time I get to the end of February, early March. I'm beginning to wonder if this is what I want to do for the rest of my career as a local superintendent, because it's a heck of a job. It's tough. I went back and figured on my calendar how many evenings and weekends I'd spent on the job, and it was about 2/3 of them. And I said, and I was starting to have a little stress in my life as far as a little health issue associated with stress. And my wife said, honey, I'd really like to retire with you alive. And I had one little scare where I thought I was having a heart attack or a stroke. It ended up being nothing. It was just stress related. And it was that very day in early March of coming off of that winter that I saw my doctor in Marysville. And he said, this is all stress related. And if you want to die, stay on the job that you're doing right now. And sure enough, so I made the decision at that point to seek another opportunity. And it was while I was involved in the process, and very few people have heard this story, but I was involved in a process of applying to be a communications director for one of the nation's largest school districts in Naples, Florida, which had been a long-time vacation spot of ours, when Dan DeGros called me. Dan was actually a reference for me. He had written a letter for me for the job. He knew I had applied in Naples, and he knew I was looking to maybe not finish my career as a local superintendent. And having been associated with Dan on a number of collaborations through the years, Dan said, why don't you have breakfast with me tomorrow morning? So I was literally in the final 2 for the job in Naples, Florida. Dan and I meet for breakfast. And he said, I've talked to our board. They wouldn't mind putting a succession plan in place. They've watched your career. As you mentioned earlier, a lot of people had. You're a public figure. It's in the paper all the time, what you're doing. And I actually have 3 people leaving RESA in the next 8 or 9 months in leadership positions, and I'd like you to come on at RESA. We'll see where it goes. If the board is kind of happy with you after a couple of years, I'm planning to retire in 2 or 3 years after you come. You could look at the superintendent job. They can look at you as a potential suitor, but there was no hard and fast, you're absolutely going to be it. But there was a plan that if you'd like it and they'd like it, then we got a potential successor when I retire. And so that literally I went home and thought about it that night, talked to my wife, and certainly finished my career in Michigan, in the county where I grew up, having worked in Marine City and St. Clair and Marysville and gone to school in Port Huron. I knew half the educators and most of the administrators in the county. It seemed like a really good fit for me in that role. So I started out as Administrative Services Director, a job that Charlie Andrews had held, former Marysville superintendent. Charlie was retiring a second time. Yeah. And so I took on Charlie's duties in that role, and then Dan slowly weaved me into upper administration at RESA, kind of planning ahead that if that's what I wanted to do, I'd be prepared. I was involved in the budget process and transportation and all these different pieces, to where when Dan finally announced, I was certain that that's what I wanted to do, was to be the superintendent at RESA.
And now it's been what, about a year? How long have you been there?
Well, April 1 officially, but Dan did such a nice job. Dan announced a year ago right now that he was leaving on March 30th. So through January, February, and March, Dan would say things like, when a person would come from administrative and say, well, we got this decision to make, Dan said, why are you asking me? Go ask Kevin. Because the board decided in December that they would offer me a contract as superintendent. So, and as we're going through the budget cycle, Dan would be in the room, but it's going to be your budget. You make the final call on this, but he would also give advice. Absolutely sensational scenario to learn from a man who had been on the job for 14 years. after being a state senator and a Senate
rep,
majority leader, a tremendous amount of respect for Dan. And those who don't know Dan, and because he didn't come from the educational realm, have no idea of how, first of all, innovative, creative, and administrative savvy, cares about, would do, literally would have given the shirt off his back for the people at RESA. Just such a dynamic leader to work for. I knew him from afar. Our kids played tennis together, but working for him and with him was one of the greatest opportunities in my career. He was a fantastic man to work for. And then he just laid the framework for such a smooth transition that literally, when we got to April 1st, the employees didn't know the difference.
Okay, one of my questions is always, well, who's been influential in your life? Okay, we got Dan DeGrow.
Absolutely.
We got Doc Emery, Rod Green.
Absolutely.
Anybody else you want to add to that list? Keitha.
Chuck Smith, who preceded me at Croslex. We sat down several times, and even after I started at Croslex, after Chuck got through the first month of having to be quiet away from in the retirement system, Chuck, I would call him often for advice. Building administrators, Tom Haddon, that I worked for, Bill Farnsworth at Marysville High School, who was a building administrator there, Charlie Andrews. My philosophy is you are a product of all the people that you come in contact with and learn from. And what I like to say is I like to incorporate the best of all the people that I've worked with and for into who I am. And I think if you do that and you take the best characteristics of the people that you come in contact with, it ends up formulating you into a pretty solid human being who carries those characteristics of caring for people, doing what's right all the time, transparency, telling the truth all the time. All those characteristics that you learn and you incorporate into who you are part of your being because of all those people that you came in contact with through your career.
Very well stated. Let me say this. We did a poll. 9 out of 10 people in St. Clair County don't know what the acronym RESA stands for. Would you please tell us?
And it really describes who we are, Tom. We're a regional education service agency. Originally, we were ISDs, intermediate school districts. And in the early 2000s, many of the ISDs around the state were being confused with intermediate schools, middle schools.
Which were the old name for middle schools and
Correct.
junior highs.
And the ISD on Range Road sat literally a mile from Marysville Middle School. And so there was a lot of confusion about what is an ISD.
Actually, this building we're in with our studio used to be called St. Clair Intermediate.
Intermediate
we
school.
used to get the mail here for the tech center, for the special education.
So I think the name change described really as a regional education service agency, your job is to serve regionally. And in St. Clair County specifically. So our role is to serve the 7 local school districts. And when I say serve, I mean serve. We're in business to serve and support, come alongside. If you need us to lead, we'll lead, but we're there to come alongside of you and support you. Financially, training, teachers and administrators, providing business services, whatever our locals need. And from a Port Huron schools of close to 9,000 students to a Memphis school with 800 students, we're different to those two entities. Port Huron needs us to support them. Memphis needs us to lead them. Memphis needs us to do things for them, to actually provide teacher training in their buildings, to take on a leadership role in the district. So we are different for all 7 of our local school districts, but we also, I think, are a countywide player, Tom. We're an entity that, along with the Community Foundation and the EDA, we're a big part of, I think, building a future in St. Clair County. We're a major employer, one, but we also service 11 townships, 2 cities. We do payroll for St. Clair County. We have evolved into an entity that services our community. We're a cradle to career organization. We serve 6-month-old children at RESA. We have play groups on our campus for 6-month-olds. We have 25-year-old special needs students that we're trying to get jobs and teaching them skills to be able to get into the workplace. So we really do so many things to serve our community. So I think that verb of service is huge in our name of Regional Education Service Agency.
Special education.
Yep.
Woodlands, but more so than that. Give us a little, I don't want to say 30, give us a minute or so on the role that RESA plays for families with students that have special needs?
So if you have a child or grandchild, Tom, that is a 2-year-old and and I have an example in our family actually, a niece who had as a young boy who wasn't speaking at 1.5 to 2 years old. It ended up being a hearing issue, and once he had his ears drained and operated on, he could hear. Mm-hmm. But so now he's behind in speaking. So that child goes to get services in our Woodland building for somebody that's developmentally behind. So the Woodland Center works with both cognitively and physically impaired students, and many are the same. They have both cognitive and physical impairments. About 2/3 of our students at the Woodland Developmental Center can't walk on their own. And so that building is such an amazing, I tell people that if you ever want to feel good about what's happening in education, take a visit to the Woodland Developmental Center. You see adults, teachers and aides and others coming alongside of kids, and those kids are in the best moments of their life because they're walking. We have a machine that's actually allowing them to communicate with their eyes that they've never been able to communicate before. So many amazing things are happening in that building that parents absolutely, and I think if you surveyed our parents there, nearly 100% of them would say we adore that building and everything that goes on in it. So those are special ed services kind of at the long end of the spectrum. But from the locals' perspective, we also present, we flow through dollars from what we call Public Act 18 to the locals to be able to provide services. We work with them on 504s and special ed certifications. We do a number of things to assist the locals from a regular special ed standpoint as well.
All right, I'm going to interrupt you because I don't know how long our tape will run, but let me go to another aspect. Okay. St. Clair Tech, I think it was known as the Skill Center when it came online back in the late 70s. What's going on with tech ed?
I think it's more important than it's ever been. First of all, I'm a huge proponent of hands-on learning. And tech is all hands-on. It's actually doing. And we've created a new paradigm at Tech, and this has evolved, and Dan kind of started the process, but we've continued. And I'm a huge proponent of, let's do a year of hands-on learning at Tech, but then let's get students into the field in year 2. So 5 of our programs now are that paradigm, where you actually get a year of learning, and then you actually go into the field and experience an internship on the job.
Give me a couple of examples.
Health occupations, our nursing program. So students get a year actually in the seats learning, and then they go to a myriad of locations, hospitals, to a nursing home, and get experience working on the job in year 2. Construction trades. Used to be a 2-year program where we build houses. We don't do that anymore. We actually build mini condos inside at RESA. A little 12 by 12, each group of students builds a condo. They learn plumbing, heating, electrical, siding, roofing, all the angles of stairs, every drywall. In year 2 then, they can choose a couple of those categories they would like to special in and go out into the field and assist our local contractors to learn that. Digital media, we're going to move in that direction as well. Get a year of digital media and then go out in the field and maybe you can do an internship here at Channel 6 or get some experience in the field. Our info technology program is that way. So we've really evolved and added this past fall construction trades in a different format. And this past fall, we added a coding class. Very important to learn computer programming in today's world. It impacts just about every job that you'll ever pursue.
And with that segue with technology, okay, you've discussed some of the things over at Tech. You mentioned a little earlier, you do a lot of payroll for different agencies, cities, school districts. How would you capsulize, when you said earlier that you were one of the first guys that was trying to get the internet involved with education, what about, in your words, how has technology changed education today compared to 20 or 25 years ago?
So it's, the best word I can use, it's ubiquitous. It went from this add-on, like if you have it, you can do certain things, to now it drives what we do. So, and I think Finland was one of the first countries that now has declared that actually having the internet is a birthright, along with, you know, services that governments provide. Internet is that important to the world as we know it today. So that's actually one of the big things that we provide at RESA is, and I'm doing a presentation for our county school boards here in a couple of weeks actually, that we spend about a little under $4 million a year on what it costs us to do IT, and we charge the locals about a little under $400,000 total. So they get basically a 90% discount, and it's those extra things that we're doing outside of our normal realm that allow us to lower that cost down for our local schools. So in a roundabout way, we are forcing more dollars into the classroom to educate students because of what we're doing on the IT level to discount it for our locals. And that's one of my philosophies, is that whatever we can do to lower costs for our local school districts, to where they can funnel more dollars into the classroom, that's one of the primary parts of my job, is to make that happen for our locals. That's philosophically, there's no other thing that's more important to me than that, because that allows them to do their job better, more effectively. And we have a problem with teacher pay now in our state. It's been going down, steadily down for 5 or 6 years. I'm very passionate about rewarding the great people in education that are on the front lines doing a great job.
Kevin, a week or two ago on this program, we interviewed a woman who was turning 100 years of age. She had a fabulous interview. If you get a chance, look at it. We're quite a ways away from your 100th birthday.
Oh my gosh,
So
yes.
let's just say this. The Kevin Miller legacy. What do you hope someday when you are in Naples and you and your wife are playing doubles tennis and you're in your 80s and somebody brings up Kevin Miller's time in St. Clair County, how do you want to be remembered, or what will you be remembered for?
Well, without going down a long track, I would hope they would say that everything I did was about making things better for students in the classroom directly. And a good example of that would be what we're putting together now as a system for our locals that will allow students to know better what their future is when they graduate, right? And I'm a perfect example of, you don't have to know exactly what you want to do, but be exposed to a number of things during your high school career that allows you to better at that finish line. When you walk across shake our hand as superintendent, you say, I have a pretty good idea what I want to do, or I have an idea what I want to do, and that drives where I go after that. But I guess a friend of education, passionate about allowing more dollars to go into the classroom, changing education overall to where it's more user-friendly, it's more engaging for students. It's one of our major roles now, is to evolve the classroom. It's got to be different than when we went to school in the 70s. It's got to look fundamentally different. Our world is fundamentally different. Students have these devices now that are more powerful than the big, football-sized mainframe computers that were built in the 60s and 70s. So when they have that in the palm of their hand, we've got to teach differently. When you can Google an answer, you shouldn't be teaching that. Let's not teach facts. Let's teach problem solving. Let's teach critical thinking. Let's teach group dynamics. Let's teach presentation skills. Let's teach all these things that we know employers are looking for. Give us young people that have those skills. We'll do the rest. So I think if you roll all those things into that, Kevin lived that life, what he said he did, then I'd be happy to have that conversation with somebody.
And I think it was a great summary. And for our listeners at home, if you've had any concerns about the direction of education in our Blue Water area in St. Clair County, I think your fears have been allayed. You have had the opportunity, if you've watched our show today, to see enthusiasm and cutting-edge educational opportunities coming to our students, your children, your grandchildren, and it's been my pleasure on Conversations to have our Superintendent of St. Clair County Regional Educational Service Agency, Kevin Miller, as our guest. Thanks, Kevin.
Tom, thank you. Been a pleasure.
You've been watching Conversations with Tom Shorkey. Conversations explores the past, the present, and the future of the communities in which we live through the eyes of interesting individuals. If you have an idea for a future conversation, please contact us at www.watchctv.org. Thanks for watching Conversations with Tom Shorkey.